Hello, and thank you for joining me here on the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thile. We're going to continue on in our study of the Torah. We're going to be looking more at the life of Jacob. Our passages for this week are Genesis chapter 28, verse 10 to chapter 32, verse 2, Hosea chapter 12, verse 13 to chapter 14, verse 9, and John chapter 1, verses 43 to 51. Again, as always, if you haven't had a chance to read the passages, I encourage you to just pause the video and go ahead and take the time to at least read them once through. I always encourage anybody who's my students or anybody else who's studying scripture to read things at least 3 times through before going into a discussion about them or listening to someone else teach about them. And so I definitely want to practice that, or I want my subscribers, those of you who are watching this on a regular basis, or even just casually getting into it, you should follow the same pattern. Just try your best to read the passages a couple of times, at least 2-3 times, different translations each time if possible, and then watch the video as they get posted. And that's why I wait till Tuesday or Wednesday to record the video and send it out there so that you have time to study. So we're looking at, again, the life of Jacob. We're looking kind of at the middle part of his life. We saw last week the beginning part of his life, and now he had to run away from home because of how he deceived he deceived Isaac over the blessing that Esau was supposed to get. And as a result, Esau was upset and had said out loud that he wanted to kill his brother. And so Rebekah told Isaac, hey, I think it's good for Jacob to go get a wife from where I'm from, not to marry any of the Canaanite women, which Isaac would agree with. But again, it was Rebekah's plan so that she could get her son out of harm's way. And so that's where we pick up on Genesis chapter 28, verse 10. You have this really honestly well-known passage. I think a lot of people who study scriptures or have been at least growing up in the church are familiar with this passage and this event that occurs here, and it's the story of Jacob having this vision of angels coming down from heaven and going back into heaven as he fell asleep in this specific place called Bethel. If you notice, the build up to the revelation of the place is interesting. Is interesting work done by the author. He says Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. So there's 2 specifically named places. Beersheba, if you remember, is a well. The name actually means the well of oath, and so it's a reference to Abimelech and Abraham making their oath at that well in Genesis chapter 21. And then Haran is the place where Laban is, and where Rebekah is from, presumably named after the brother of Abraham who passed away. Don't really know if it was already named that or not, but it has the same name as his brother, the father of Lot, who had died. And so he's going there, and in between, it says in verse 11, he happened upon a certain place. And if you're seeing the screen right now, you see that I've highlighted happened upon a certain place, and then it says, and he took the stones from the place, and then he lay down in that place. And so what I think the author is doing is something Robert Alter pointed out in his commentary, and I agree with, is that the author is the writer is building up to this reveal of what this place is, or at least the name of it. And so it's kind of like if you're reading this for the first time, and way back in when it was first written, you're like, oh, what's the place? What's that place? Do you remember that place? Or maybe somebody who really knows the story would be like, oh, I know where this is, and just wait till we check it out. I know I've done that. Like I read Lord of the Rings so many years ago, watched the movies, and I definitely had those moments where you see something in the movie, and because you read the book, you're like, oh, whoever you're with, you're like, hey, just wait till this moment, pay attention to that. You remember that? You remember what they just said? And I think I could imagine people doing the same thing as they're reading this writing. They've heard the stories before being told by mouth. They get to this part, certain place. Oh, pay attention to that. Just check out where that's going to be. Do you know where that is? And just like this anticipation is building up towards it, towards the reveal. But before we get there about where the place is, we find out this really incredible thing about where it is Jacob's at. He has this dream and he sees a stairway on earth that goes up to reach the heavens. And this past Sunday, the person who spoke at our church actually went through this passage and in John chapter 1. And so actually, I didn't get a chance to talk to him. I was wondering if maybe he studies the same Torah passages, and so he just shared a message based on that. But he mentioned this fact, which, well, actually, it's really a note that I read in Robert Alter's commentary, so I don't know where he got it from. Again, I didn't have a chance to talk to him. But Alter mentioned that this vision, a lot of times, we see stairway written here. Other translations will say ladder. He believed that it is more like the shape of a ziggurat. So if you pull up like a Mesopotamian ziggurat, kind of going back to like the tower, the type of tower that Nimrod was building in Genesis chapter 11, a kind of terraced tower. If you think almost like a pyramid, but at the top it's flat. And then you have staircases on all four sides that go up, up the middle of each side towards the top. That Alter feels that because of the time in which this was written and this event was happening, there's probably the image that the people of that time would have imagined. For us today, like you hear stairway, you picture, a staircase going up, but without, the base of it being like that ziggurat shape, like that pyramid type shape with the apex cut off. And so, because that makes sense to us, we don't see a lot of ziggurats around where we are, right? Or other translations say ladder. So we're picturing, like an A-shaped ladder, or, the kind of ladder like painters use against a house. Like, so the image that we picture has a lot to do with what we're used to. And so for Alter, he felt that the image of a ziggurat is what made sense. And honestly, as you look at it, he sees that God is standing at the top of it and everything else. It does make sense if you have this four-sided thing and there's a stairway going up, and at the top, and angels are coming up and down, probably on all four sides. And if you read the book of Zechariah, you see that God will send angels out east and west and north and south to go in the different directions to, report for him or to act on his behalf, and just to follow whatever commands he has. It's in the book of Zechariah, where Zechariah has all these really interesting visions. And so I like the idea of a four-sided ziggurat. Each side has its own staircase, and so angels like, oh, you're going to go north, and so an angel goes down that way and then goes north, and then one side goes on the other side where it's east and west and whatever, and south, and so that's just the image I have in my head. And so Jacob sees this, and he hears God speak to him, and God reiterates the covenant he has with Moses with Abraham, about how he was going to bless the entire earth through their seed. And this reminds me of what I talked about last week. It's like, Jacob is trying so hard to be the one to receive the promise, but in the end, it's God who chooses. I really don't think Jacob had to deceive his dad for a blessing or even buy his brother's birthright. I think Jacob would have at any moment had fallen asleep and had God speak to him, have God point out to him, hey, Jacob, you're the one that I've chosen to be the one who then blesses the whole earth, just like I chose Abraham and Isaac before you. I strongly believe that. But here he finds himself in a situation where he's running away, and this just happens to be the moment that God uses to make that call to him. Now, just real quick, just in case there's some confusion or just questions about how exactly God speaks and what's going on here. I just want to point out, not all exhaustive study of the subject, but in Numbers chapter 12, and it's in doing this study over the last couple of years, I've mentioned before, where I came to realize this passage and what it meant and the significance of it. But in Numbers chapter 12, verse 6, God is confronting Aaron and Miriam. They're having some words and some thoughts about Moses and his authority as a prophet and their leader. And so God is speaking to them. He says, hear now my words. He says, when there's a prophet of Adonai, a prophet of the Lord, I reveal myself in a vision and I speak to him in a dream. And so what that verse tells me, in that verse, what God is telling Miriam and Aaron is what qualifies a person to say that they are a prophet of God is the fact that I speak to them in vision or in dreams. And so you see throughout Scripture, the events like that happening where people are being spoken to by God through a vision or dream. And for Jacob in this moment, he fell asleep and he's seeing this, and that's considered, but it's very vivid. But it's like, is that a dream? It's a vision. It's kind of a combo of both. Sometimes you see it very clearly. Like with Ezekiel, he was just by a river, and then he just looks up and he sees like this vision of this crazy chariot, and so that's how God communicates to him. And the rest of that passage in Numbers, God is saying, but for Moses, I spoke to face. And I will go back to that later about the significance and importance of who Moses was as a prophet. But in this case, in this scenario, Jacob is having a vision and a dream, and it's just the way that God has chosen to speak to him. And he's showing him something about the nature of God's work on the earth, and then he's giving a message. The nature of God's work is again, the sending out the angels out to go do his bidding, and angels coming back to report to him about what they see on the earth. And I know that sounds like, what? That doesn't, like, God doesn't need that. No, of course he doesn't need that. But you read again in the book of Zechariah, there are, like, I think it was like 7 angels who go out. It's like, those are God's eyes. And there's 7 ministering spirits, all this stuff. And all it speaks to God's structure and how he is, has this angelic group and how he puts them to work. And one of the ways that he puts them to work is to send them out over to the earth to report back to him what they see. And then he gives them, directives and tells them what to say as he sends it back out to then report to them. And then and so that's why in Job chapter 1, you see the sons of God representing themselves to God on a certain day, and that's where Satan, the adversary, shows up. So this is just kind of like rooted in kind of the understanding, the theology of who God is and how he functions in the earth and with human beings, and that again is being him sending angels out to monitor what's happening with the people. Now, God promises at the end of his speaking with Jacob, he says, "I will not forsake you until I have done what I have promised you. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not forsake you until I have done what is promised you." It's worded kind of interestingly. It's kind of funny. Like, I will not forsake you until you do that, but it's just like, I will not leave until what I've done is promised, right? So I'm going to stay with you. And the promise is a long-term promise. It's like a forever promise where he's going to bless the whole earth through Jacob's seed. So Jacob wakes up. So that tells us that the whole time it was a dream. The distinction is a vision kind of happening while you're awake, while meditating, that kind of thing. Like Peter sitting on top of the building in Acts chapter 10 and seeing the food come down on a sheet and being told to eat. Like, that was a vision. So he wakes up, and what he does is he associates the place that he's at with the house of God. So he thinks like this space specifically is really important because this is where God is. Like where he saw this event happening is where he thought it was actually happening. So it was more than just a dream. He had the dream because of where he was. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. And so he names the place Bethel, which means the house of God, and he calls it the gate of heaven. And certainly it makes sense that if you had that experience, you associate it with like the place that you were at. But I know that when God called Abraham, he called him out of somewhere else. When he spoke to Isaac, he called him from somewhere else. And later on in scripture, as he talks to different people, he calls them from different places. And so I don't necessarily associate the place itself with the place where God dwells or where he acts. But that's certainly what Jacob thought. And so he named the place Bethel, and he went from there to put up a stone, and he memorializes the area. He pours oil on it. It's like anointing, separating it for a purpose. And then what's interesting is at the end of this, he makes kind of a conditional vow. Not kind of, it is a conditional vow to God. He says, if God will be with me and watch over me on this way that I'm going, and provide me food to eat and clothes to wear, and I return in peace to my father's house, then Adonai will be my God. So he said, so if you just read it like plain language, Jacob puts a condition on his decision to obey God, and that condition is based on God coming through on what he has promised Jacob. I wouldn't necessarily do that kind of thing, but hey, that's something that Jacob is recorded as doing, and so he did that, and he promises to give God a tenth of everything he's given. Now, it's here that I want to switch over to John chapter 1, because the passage from the New Testament that's given to us this week for the reading by Lion Lamb Ministries, and I think most of the Messianic ministries would use this passage as well, is John chapter 1, verse 43, and Jesus' interaction with Nathanael. And so Jesus is gathering disciples at the beginning of the book of John. He finds Nathanael, and Nathanael says, Nazareth, like, how can anything good come from there? This is kind of the prevailing thought, idea about where the place that Jesus was from. And Philip says, come and see, right? And so Yeshua saw Nathanael coming. He said, look, a true Israelite. There's nothing false in him. And he's like, how do you know me? And he says, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. He says, Rabbi, Nathanael answered, you are Ben Elohim, the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. And Jesus responds, because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree, you believe? Yeshua replied to him, you will see greater things than that. And he said, amen, amen, I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God going up and coming down on the Son of Man. And so with verse 51, having read the passage in Genesis chapter 28, the understanding of what God is saying, or what Jesus is saying to Nathanael, is understood, right? Is made clear that what Jesus is telling Nathanael is, you're going to see what Jacob saw happen, and where you're going to see it, though, is you're going to see it happen with me. You're going to see God act. You're going to see the place where God, the earth connects with heaven. You're the gate of heaven, like Jacob exclaimed in Genesis chapter 28. He called it the house of God and the gate to heaven. Jesus is saying, you're going to see this gate opened. You're going to see this interaction that God has with the earth and with people, with the ministering of angels and everything else. You're going to see that happen through me and what I am about to show you. And what's really cool is so if you want to know more about John, I did a series on John and the signs in John and the I am statements of John. And so that's also on this YouTube channel. You can look at the playlist and on the study of John. But in doing that study, I came to learn that Nathanael represented the Jewish person who did not identify with a certain line of theology. And that line of theology and belief was the idea that the Messiah would be from the line of David. Now, Jesus later in this book, John clarifies that, and Jesus clarifies that in Jerusalem and the importance of it. But there was a split in the belief in theology, and that split was understood between the Samaritans and between the Judeans, or the Jewish people that lived in Jerusalem and Judea. They had developed separate theologies. One of their core instances of fighting with each other was about, or disagreements was about where to worship, which is what the Samaritan woman asks Jesus in chapter 4. Is what's the right place to worship? If you notice, Jesus' answer to her is salvation comes from the Jews, so they have it right in terms of where the Messiah comes from, because they also disagreed with that whole thing. But God is looking for worshipers who worship in spirit and in truth. And so what he was communicating to her is kind of like, you both have it right, where the place might matter, like Jerusalem is important, but ultimately the worship of God can happen anywhere as long as the worshiper of God is someone who's worshiping in the spirit and in truth. And so if we look at this passage, this very beginning part of the book of John, John is writing his gospel to Samaritan Jews, most likely. And as they read it, they see Nathanael as themselves. And the conclusion that John has, that he wants every reader of the book of John to understand, is that Jesus is the Son of God and that he's the King of Israel. The same conclusion that Nathanael has here. You are Ben Elohim. You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. And so that's the conclusion that John wants each of his readers to have. And Jesus and John writing this whole story and the whole opening and everything else What Jesus says is, wow, for this simple thing, you believe, but you're going to see something even greater. You're going to see something like what Jacob saw when he fell asleep, where he saw the place where the gate of heaven was open and angels coming down and forth and ministering. And so basically you're going to see the place where heaven meets earth and where God acts. And so that's the Gospel of John. That's the healing of the blind man, the lame man, the person, the person who was blind from death, blind from birth, and just that whole situation in John chapter 10. After that is when he says, I am the gate. I am the way in and out, right? So further clarifying what Jacob saw, the idea of what the gate of heaven is tied to the identity of Jesus in John chapter 1. And so for the believer of Jesus as the Messiah, as we look at this passage, we can see then the importance of understanding, okay, what was it that Jacob saw? How did he see it? What did it mean and everything else? But then also, how does it apply to the Messiah? And that is that, we don't have to go find Bethel. We don't have to find any specific place to find a place where God can meet with us and where we can then meet with him. The place of meeting him is in his spirit. The place of meeting him is in truth. And that truth is found in the personal work of the Lord Jesus as he demonstrated while he was on earth and as he proved in his death and his resurrection. And so that's where we have that takeaway as believers in Jesus as the Messiah, as Jesus as the Anointed One, in Jesus as the Christ, the Savior of the earth. Now, with all that said, the integration part is kind of done. And what I just want to do is look at some other key points in the story that's here, it's presented to us. And then also look at the Hosea passage and what that has to do with the reading and how it may apply to us as well as believers in Jesus. Because I think there are some important aspects to connect between the two. Now, in Genesis chapter 29, you have the story of Jacob falling in love with Rachel and marrying her and all that kind of stuff. And what this story does is it highlights for the reader the character of Jacob, the character of Laban, the character of Leah and Rachel, and really just the beginnings of the creation of this nation, the nation of Israel. We know that later Jacob's name is going to be called Israel. And in looking at their stories and looking at their character, in all of that, also focusing on the faithfulness of God. And ultimately, it's him that's important in all of this, because as a people, they're not perfect. Each of them have sin. Each of them have sin in different ways. Each of them fail. And yet it's, again, God who chooses who he's going to make a covenant with. And it's God who decides what the parameters of his relationship with any given human will be. And he invites us into relationship now through his son Jesus and through belief. But with the nation of Israel, it was simply, you are mine because I chose you. Obey my commandments, keep my way, and you will prosper in the land, Deuteronomy. But if you don't, then you're going to come across ruin. And so in each life, in each of these characters' lives and stories, you want to kind of see these themes play out and how and what that looks like and the trouble that's caused by unfaithfulness, and then to then go back and look at how faithful God is and how his faithfulness in the end overcomes and solves the issues caused by our failures. So Jacob gets to this well. This is presumably the same well that Eliezer reached in an earlier study, I think back in Genesis chapter 20 or 20, no, it's like 23, I think, when he is sent by Abraham to go find a bride for Isaac, and that's where he met Rebekah. And if you remember, when Eliezer gets there, he sees the well and then he waits, and then in his mind he's thinking, okay, so I'm looking for a righteous woman, and he's looking for signs of righteousness, and so he comes up with a game plan of what he's looking for, and he prays that game plan out in the eyes of God so that he can confirm with God what he's looking for. And then Rebekah comes and she serves him, and everything's done according to how he saw it, and so he was confirmed. Now, when Jacob gets to this well, things have changed. In that story, it seemed that Laban was still, his father was still alive, but now it's very clear that Laban's the one in charge. Laban's the elder of the household. And what he's done is he's put a stone on top of the well. Right? It says here in verse 2, the stone on the mouth of the well was very large. And so they would have to roll away the stone and water the flocks. And so Jacob gets there, he sees the stone. He's like, hey, why don't you guys go ahead and water the flocks? As being a shepherd himself, or actually it says that he stayed at home, but being aware at least of when to water the animals and everything else, he felt like now was the time to do that. But they were telling him, oh, it's the middle of the day. He says the middle of the day, let them go graze and stuff. But he says, we can't until the stone is rolled away, because apparently it's like a big, heavy stone. And it speaks to, Laban's character and nature. He talked about it going back to, I think it was chapter 23, how greedy he came across in his interactions with Eliezer. It seemed like he wanted more and more money or dowry or bridal price or whatever, the gold and the jewelry and everything else that was being offered for Rebecca. It seemed like he was trying to extend his time, or the Eliezer's time with them, so they could milk him for more. It seemed like his mother was in on that plan, but it was Rebecca who said, no, I have enough, let's go. And so they left. Now we get back and Laban's in charge, like I said, and he's controlling the amount of water that could be had at any given moment, right? Nobody has free access. And apparently, again, this is like a big stone, and it takes probably a couple guys to roll this off of there. But Jacob now is able to do it himself. So there was a note, I think it was Alter, but I read so many different things, but there was a note by one of the commentators I read, just like, he went from like being a simple man in a tent. Remember that description last week's reading? But now he's like this big, strong guy who at Bethel was moving stones and going to sleep on them. And he's lifting up this stone himself. It's like maybe he got stronger as he was going out in the wilderness or out of whatever it might be. But he's just doing this like huge feat. And it's symbolic of the relationship he's going to have with Laban. Laban's very stingy with his resources, and Laban wants to make sure he gets the most out of whatever is there, and that he gets it for himself. Jacob's going to come along and disrupt that plan. Here he takes the stone off the well. Like, here, everyone water as you see fit, and it opens up, back the wealth to whoever's there for sharing. And I think it's Jacob who gets the most out of it. Because from this interaction, he meets Rachel and he falls in love with Rachel. And now this is the one that he wants to be his wife. Notice what Laban does here in verse 14. It says that, so when Laban meets Jacob, and they're hugging, kissing, family, yay, ooh, whatever. And then he stays with him for a month. And after a month in verse 15, he's like, hey, I should pay you. Right. So at that point made me smile to myself. He's like, okay, so you got like a free month labor. Maybe he was in his mind charging him for taking the stone off the well and for the water that was had. Who knows? But he says, what should your wages be? And Jacob has nothing. It's really interesting at this moment to see how like Isaac sends Jacob off to go to his family. And if Isaac had any kind of wealth, he didn't give any of it to Jacob to take with him. Jacob just went on his own. He didn't have much. The idea that he found a place and he rolled a stone and slept on it, that also communicates to us he didn't have much. He's just on this journey in the wilderness. When Abraham sent Eliezer, remember he had a whole thing of camels and gold and wealth, and he had a group of guys to go with him. And so, it was a different circumstance. Jacob's going seemingly empty-handed. And so it says that he's loved Rachel, and so for wages, he's like, okay, I'll serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. It speaks to two things. Jacob understands he has to pay a bridal price, which most cultures, societies today, this kind of thing is not done because of the abuse that women end up taking over, parents only wanting daughters and selling selling them to terrible husbands and everything else. There are cultures that still do it. Some cultures have, outlawed it, but then people still work their way around it, so on and so forth. But this is the system that was existent at this time with the Hebrew people. And so he's like, okay, I'll work 7 years. So again, it tells me that he doesn't have any money, so he's got to work for it. And to offer 7 years of labor means he knows the kind of man Laban is and what it's going to take to satisfy his greed, or whatever it is he's going to want as a price for his daughter Rachel. I just want to point out in verse 17, it says Leah's eyes were delicate, Rachel's were beautiful. Just understand that doesn't mean that Leah's eyes were weak, that she couldn't see well. Some translations historically have translated that way, that Leah's eyes were weak, and they're trying to kind of give us a reason why to denigrate her, or to say she wasn't as good as Rachel. The truth is that verse 17 is a comparison of beauties, that Leah's eyes were delicate, they were beautiful, they were nice to look at. They were soft eyes, they were attractive. So if that was a quality of hers that the writer shows or tells us is a positive. But Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Was just that for Jacob, Rachel was everything he was looking for. Leah had those pretty eyes, and Rachel was everything. And I'm guessing, right, this is the Rebecca's niece. I'm guessing that a little bit of, as a psychology major, or maybe there's a little bit of transference or whatever, and he sees, a younger version of his mom. And it's okay, that happens. Qualities, appearances, it's not too weird. It's just kind of how something could be. And so I'm wondering if maybe there was like a similarity there. But whatever it was Rachel that caught his eye, and he agrees to work 7 years for her. And here we get to a point where I've noticed that a lot of people get wrong. Up until recently, I got it wrong too. I always thought that Jacob had to work 14 years before marrying Rachel, but that's not exactly what happened. So after he works the 7 years, what's really sweet, it's probably one of the most romantic verses, I guess. It says, so Jacob worked for Rachel 7 years, yet in his eyes it was like a few days because of his love for her. So it just kind of, the time was it just went by so quickly, 7 years. And then as soon as the 7 years is over, the language is very abrupt. It says, give me my wife. So I'm ready to get married. Give me Rachel. Laban has a feast. The implication is that they drink, and Jacob can't tell the difference when Leah is brought to him. We know that Laban also had a feast for Eliezer and had him drink also, and he was trying to get Eliezer to stay. And so definitely kind of feels like a pattern of Laban's to try to get more out of what he was doing, or whatever he was getting. And that's one of his ways to do that, was to get people to drink and to have a good time, and then work in a way to deceive and manipulate and get to where he wants to go. And so it says that Laban gave him Leah instead of Rachel. So he doesn't notice until the next morning. And so they sleep together, and now Leah is his wife. And Jacob's upset. He's like, it was Rachel that I worked for. And this is where, again, even I myself, and just in the last year, in the reading of this portions where I realized this, is verse 26. It says, complete the bridal week for this one, then we'll also give you this other for work you'll do with me another 7 years more. So what Jacob had to agree with was complete the bridal week, traditional, just 1 week, that first week of marriage. Then I'll let you marry Rachel, and then you got to work another 7 years for me. So it's like he's taking on debt. I'll let you marry Rachel after a week, but then you owe me another 7 years of work. And that's what happened. And it's actually really clear here in the passage. So anybody who tells you that, oh, he worked 14 years, he did work 14 years to have the right, to be clear of his debt. Right? But he only had to wait the 7 years and 1 week to marry Rachel. So he didn't have to wait 14 years to marry her. Just a distinction in language. But to get it right in our heads, I think it's important. So he serves him another 7 years, and then he it tells us that he loves Rachel more than he loves Leah, and it makes sense. And I wonder, my wife and I had discussion about this before, like how much did Leah know? Did Leah think, was she lied to? Did she think that, oh, she's getting married first because she's the firstborn, which is what Laban says? Is Leah in on the deception? She's like, okay, Dad, he's like, listen, I'm going to send you in when he's drunk, and you go in and you sleep with him, and then you'll be married. We don't know. We're not told exactly what Leah knew going into the whole situation. I find it hard to believe that she didn't know how much he loved Jacob, or Jacob loved her sister, given the descriptions that are given to us here about his feelings for her. So it's hard for me to reconcile the idea that Leah uh, wasn't in on the plan to get married to Jacob, and part of the plan with her dad and everything else. But again, that's just my feelings about it. I certainly, like I said, talked to my wife about it. She felt differently. That can definitely be the case, where she was kind of just going along with it, thought it was part of the plan, thought Jacob knew about it, and was a victim in it and all of this herself. Now, as so the story between Laban's interactions with Jacob and Jacob's interaction with Laban, they take a pause here to take an aside to give us the story of Rachel and Leah, and their rivalry with each other over Jacob and the birth of sons. So it's kind of a longer passage here. I don't want to spend too much time in it, but I will go ahead and hit some of the main points here, just so that I can say that we covered it and we see some of the more important things, like the names of the children and everything else and where they come from, because later on these are going to be characters and stories that we're going to need to know. So the scripture tells us so we're in Genesis chapter 29, it looks like. Yeah, 29. And so what we're considering now is, or who are the sons of Leah, who are the sons of Bilhah, who are the sons of Zilpah, and who are the sons of Rachel. And so I didn't go all into it, but Zilpah was the servant, the maid servant for Leah, and then Bilhah was the female servant for Rachel, and those two, the two women pull a Sarah, and they're like, okay, why don't you sleep with my servant to have kids, because I can, and so then they ends up having kids with 4 different women. In his marriage to 2 different women. It's a mess. It's all a mess. And if you ever wonder, is this such a mess? Why is this such a mess? It's because that's kind of the point. We have messy people. Humans are messy. Anybody who's ever deified the patriarchs and everything that they did was perfect, I don't know what they were doing. Abraham comes the closest. Abraham also submitted to his wife's desire to with Hagar and all that stuff, so there's like a failure too. Again, the story and the whole point isn't about the patriarchs and how awesome they were. It's about God. It's about God and how faithful he is, how awesome he is. To see human beings, and again the flood, and how the flood was caused by people and their evil hearts and wicked hearts. And he said to himself, I got to do something different I can do something differently so that human beings don't end up on the same trajectory that ended with me having to flood the earth, especially since I'm not going to do that anymore. And so it was his plan to make a faithful covenant, a covenant that he himself is going to hold himself to. No one else is going to hold him to it, and it's going to be based on him being alive and his power and his authority. He's going to make this covenant with a specific person, and now the story is showing us how he is remaining faithful to that covenant despite the failures of the people that we are reading about. So we get to this part now where the children things is happening. Leah, it says that God saw that Leah was unloved and Rachel was unable to conceive, but Leah was. So what the writer is telling us, that God sees how Jacob is treating Leah and Rachel and the differences between the two, no matter how the marriage happened, the fact that Jacob was taken advantage of, that he married someone he didn't want to marry and everything else, God is still holding him accountable for not treating his wife well. And the narrative of the story and the theology and the viewpoint is that Leah is able to have children because God is acting justly in response to Jacob's unjust behavior between his 2 wives. So Leah becomes pregnant. Her first son she names Reuben. Notice that she first names him for Adonai has seen my affliction. So the names of the children are related to these concepts. You're going to see in every one of these names there's a phrase is for Adonai has seen my affliction. A key phrase there is going to be the root word for the name that then comes from it. So Reuben, seen my affliction. Now my husband will love me. Sorry, Leah, it's not going to happen, but that's her hope. She gets pregnant again. She has Simeon. And so you have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Those are the first four sons of Jacob, and all four of them are sons of Leah. And it's Judah, the last one, where Leah says, "This time I praise Adonai." So the first three she names after concepts and ideas related to Jacob not loving her and her hoping that now with the birth of the son, her husband would love her. It's not until the fourth child where she says, okay, this one I'm giving God praise for. So she's seeing, what that tells me is that she's seeing now like the birth of these children as a gift from God. We all should, right? It's a gift from him, not something to manipulate other people with through, deception or whatever. Oh, if I got a kid, he'll love me more. What's crazy is people still think this way in today's world. But at the end, it's just, I give God glory and praise because he's given me this child. And so that's Judah. And if you're familiar with the scriptures, you probably realize the importance of the names. If not Reuben and Simeon, you will remember the name Levi and the Levites and the priestly tribe. And then you have Judah, which of course is the tribe of David and the tribe that the Messiah is promised to come from. So then she stopped having children. And it just says that's it for her. When Rachel saw that she didn't have any children, so she pulls a Sarah, like I said earlier. If that's disrespectful, I don't know. I just think it's fine to say because it's the example Sarah set. Although, Rachel doesn't know Sarah, probably never heard the story. But she goes to Jacob and she complains, "Give me sons and I'll die." If you remember with Rebekah and Isaac, Rebekah's womb was also closed. Sarah's womb was closed. But with Rebekah and Isaac, Rebekah couldn't give birth, and it tells us that Isaac just went before God and prayed, and then God opened her womb. So maybe Rachel's thinking the same thing. She's like, "Give me sons," and she's expecting Jacob to then go pray. Like that's the thing he could do, right? When she says, "Give me sons, if they're none, I'll die," she's being very dramatic about it. It can happen with the emotions and everything else. I don't judge it. She is being dramatic in that sense. Like, I'll just die if I don't have any kids. No sons. And Jacob's like, "Oh, what am I going to do?" Instead of God, like he's the one that held it back. And again, the difference between Jacob and Isaac went and prayed. Abraham, it seemed like also cared for his wife, was concerned about his wife, was receiving promises about his wife. For him, it was just like, when is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? Either way, Rachel and Sarah come up with the same plan. Here, take the servant. And I just look at him like, yeah, the husbands. I mean, whether it's Abraham or Jacob, it's like, okay, yeah, I'll take the servant. Again, the difference with Isaac is like he just prayed and God blessed him and opened up Rebekah's womb and she had the twins. I feel like that's the way to go rather than, trying to have a baby with someone else and then give birth with the woman at the knees, which is what she says here. It's like in verse 3, so that you can, say that the child is yours, not the woman who gave birth. But whatever it was, she got pregnant. Bilhah got pregnant. And she gave birth to Dan. And then she's like, oh, it worked. So I guess God's going to, God has judged my cause and give me a son. So she's seeing it as God saying, okay, I accept this plan. The language of the text tells us not exactly the case. It just happens to be that she's, the girl is getting pregnant and having boys. And so Rachel says, okay, I'm going to do it again. And then they have Naphtali. And then Leah sees that she's not having kids, and then she sees that Rachel's having success with her maidservant. She's like, oh, let me take Zilpah, my female servant, and give him to Jacob. And again, Jacob, the guy's like, all right, yeah, let's do this. This is just like kind of wild. And so that servant has a son named Gad, and then they have another son named Asher. So now we're having the tribes of Israel come into play. Of the 12 tribes, we have them coming in with now, I think this is number 10. And because Joseph is this is number 9. And then you're going to have this story, with the mandrake. So what's a mandrake? It was like a tomato-shaped fruit. The main idea, though, is that they were considered to be an aphrodisiac and like a medicinal thing to help with fertility. And that's why when Reuben found them, he brought them to his mom, Leah, because she's the one that hasn't been able to conceive for a little while, went to another servant. Rachel sees the mandrakes. She's like, oh, let me have them. And Leah's like, you've taken my husband. So she feels like she was first. It was her husband, and Rachel came in and stole him. Not exactly it, Leah. He always loved Rachel, right? But I understand where she's feeling. But that's how she feels, that Rachel stole her husband. And so Rachel's like, okay, I'll let you have him tonight if you give me the mandrake. So they would sleep in separate tents. Leah had her own tent. Rachel had her own. Jacob would come home. Probably most nights go with Rachel because that's the one he loved, unless he was, wanting to be with Leah. She's the one that's having sons, and just the whole thing is a mess, right? Said it was a messy thing. So they make this deal, and Leah actually says, tongue in cheek, like, hey, you're coming to my tent tonight because I hired you with mandrakes. So she's telling us not only how she feels about her husband, that she's got to pay for his services, but also how she feels about herself. She doesn't feel loved. She doesn't feel cared about. She's like, if she wants any kind of attention, she's got to pay for it to get it. And so he lays with her, and yet it tells us that, so she didn't eat the mandrakes, right? That goes to Rachel, the fertility, all that. But in that moment, whatever it was that Leah said to God, he hears her, and she gets pregnant. So if Leah prayed, like, God, please let me get pregnant tonight, let my husband love me, whatever, I don't know. She gives birth to a fifth son. Now, what's interesting is she says that God rewarded her because of the female servant. So, yeah, I don't know about that, Leah, but that's what it says. That's what she believed, and she named him Issachar. Oh, so that would be number 8. That'd be son number 8. Then Leah became pregnant with the 6th son for Jacob. I'm talking about overall for Jacob. That's number 8. Then number 10 should be Zebulun. And then number 11 is Joseph. That's why I was trying to get to 11 is Joseph. So 11 is Joseph. Zebulun is number 10. Issachar is number 9. Right. And now, so Leah gets pregnant again. That she has 2 more sons. And then she gives birth to a daughter, Dinah, which she's going to come into play later. And so if you remember the sons of Leah, and then she has the daughter, Dinah, and then the one son of Rachel at this point is Joseph in verse 24. And it says that God remembered Rachel and God listened to her and opened her womb. So this is the moment where God is listening to her prayer. It's not when she was giving up a servant for her husband to sleep with. And so the story of the rivalry between Rachel and Leah ends here for now with all the sons and their births laid out. And again, the story, the writing of Genesis really draws into parallels with each other. And so before we had this story of rivalry between 2 sisters, we had the story of rivalry between 2 brothers. We had that twice already. We had Ishmael and Isaac, although that rivalry seemed to be between Sarah and Hagar, not so much the boys. It seems like the boys, at the end, they came together to bury Abraham. And it seemed like they were living closer to each other. You look at the locations, the places where Isaac was located, where he was living, and where Ishmael was living. And so it does seem like they had a more open relationship with each other than it might seem. And then you had the rivalry between Jacob and Esau, and now you have this rivalry between Leah and Rachel. And so that story is interjected here between the rivalry or the conflict between Jacob and Laban. And their conflict, again, is centered around the acts of righteousness, the fair payment for those who come from other places to work for you. That's what's going on here. In the book of Deuteronomy, God lays out through Moses his expectations for the people of Israel and how they would treat people who travel to their country to work. He says, God says he loves the outsider, Deuteronomy chapter 10. He loves the outsider, and he expects the people of Israel to treat the outsider well. He expects them to pay them fair wages. In chapter 19, he curses those who don't do so, who take advantage of the sojourner, the traveler, and as the day sets, they don't pay them, and it puts them through all that stress because day laborers, they need to have their pay every day because they rely on that. And so this story, in overall, like a bigger arc, thinking about what God is important to God, you see the mistreatment of a traveler, a sojourner, by the one who's wealthy, the one whose land the land belongs to, and who calls the place home, and how that's not right. But in that situation, how God then looks at the sojourner and blesses them with just the prosperity and the peace and everything else that Jacob is looking for. So, and that's me talking about his vow earlier. If I come back with the peace, I in my household, then I will make the Lord my God. So now looking at the passage specifically, in verse 25 of chapter 30, Jacob says he's got all these sons now. He's got 11 kids, 11 sons, 4 different wives. He's got the one daughter as well. So that's all the kids, and he's got 12 kids total. And he says, let me, my wives, and my children go. Right? He's ready to go. He's got plenty. He's grown a lot, but he wants to be paid. He's like, give me my wives to served you, and to yourself know my labor that I served you. And so 14 years he had to work for Rachel, right? He married her after 7 in 1 week, but he had to work 14 years to pay off the bridal price, which ended up being for 2 daughters. So he did that. And now I believe it's about another 6 years of him working. And during this time, he says to us later that Laban switched over his wages 10 different times. So 10 different times Laban changed his mind about how he was going to pay Jacob and what Jacob would take away as his own. So Jacob makes this point to tell Leah and Rachel how unjust their father has been towards him about payment. But in verse 27, so he says, what you name your price and I'll pay it. And he comes up with this plan. He says, I'll go through your livestock and I'll pick out all of the sheep, the lamb that are dark colored, that have spots, that are goated, all of the stripes and everything else that, just basically don't look perfect. I'm going to take as my own, and that will be my salary. And so I'm going to go do that now, and I'm going to take them out of your flock, separate them. The rest of the flock is yours, and then these will be mine. And Laban agrees to it. Right? Laban agrees to it. Says, all right, it may be according to your word. So on that day, you remove the color-free striped, and I'm reading in verse 35, and colorful billy goats, as well as the colorfully spotted goats, everyone with white on it, every dark color among the lambs, you put them in the hand of his sons. And then he put a 3 days journey between them, Jacob, while Jacob was shepherding Laban's remaining flocks. Now, what does Jacob do? He comes up with the plan. He knows that the flocks, the male sheep and specifically, are going to go into heat. So they're going to start breeding soon. He knows the timing. He's been working with the sheep very well. And so in verse 38, there's this interesting thing about where he's peeling these branches and he's placing them at the water troughs. And I know that there's some commentators, a lot of them really, that kind of thought that this is like some kind of like related to the mandrakes. It's like an aphrodisiac. It's a fertility thing. The smell of it, the strip thing, it's going to make the goats go wild. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's even been proven. But because I've had my background in psychology and even like behavioral psychology and like reinforcement of behaviors, I kind of was wondering, like, was Jacob actually conditioning these animals to mate when he wanted them to mate, and to mate how he wanted them to mate? Because what ends up happening is he starts off with a small group of the spotted, colorful, whatever, but because of the way that he does this thing with the branches, it says in verse 39, at the end of verse 38, since they were in heat when they came to drink, the flocks mated near the branches, and the flocks gave birth to striped, spotted, and colorful ones. And then he separated those. Then whenever the strong flocks mated, Jacob put the branches in the watering troughs before the eyes of the flocks, to have them mate near the branches. So the eyes, he's like, he wants them to see this certain thing. And I feel like he's conditioning them. He's putting forth triggers to get them to see something like, oh, now is the time to mate, which we know animals can be trained this way. And so by doing that, he became extremely prosperous, because now he was purposely breeding. He initiated his own breeding program, and he got the flocks that Laban had agreed to give him to be more numerous than the ones that Laban agreed to take. And that was the sign of wealth. You had a bunch more sheep. You can cut their wool and sell it. That was worth money. The milk, whatever. It's just like practical. The amount of cattle you had was a sign of your wealth. So as that happens, the sons of Laban, they look and they're like, whoa, Jacob is stealing from dad. He is taking everything that belongs to him. This started off one way. Dad had more flocks and everything, but what Jacob has done now is made it so that these flocks are all going to go with him. He's stealing. And so they go and tell their dad. And in verse 2, it tells us that Jacob saw his face, Laban's face, and was like, yeah, it's not the same as it was. His disposition was different. He can see that Laban's thinking some things. And I can't help but remember when Esau said, I'm going to kill my brother. If Jacob saw his face after he saw that, or, just had like an interaction, and Esau's giving him a dirty look, the stink eye, whatever, I could imagine if Laban's doing the same thing, I'm going to kill this guy. Jacob can definitely pick up on it because he's seen it before. And again, that's just where my mind is going. I don't know if that actually happens, but I like to think that's the way it's happening. And so in verse 3, it tells us what God tells Jacob: to return to the land of your fathers, to your relatives, and I will be with you. And you remember his promise to Jacob in chapter 28. Part of that promise is, I will guard you. I will guard you. And so this moment, God has been watching all of this, blessing him. He's got sons, he's got children, he's got wives, he's got flocks. And now he sees this moment, so because now is the time for me to protect him physically and take him out of there. I will guard you. And so he tells him to leave, return to the land of your fathers and your relatives. And so he goes to Rachel and Leah. Now, all we see that God tells him is return back home. Jacob adds words that God has given to him. He says, first he says, the God of fathers has been with me. Now yourselves know that I served my father all my strength, because your father has fooled around with me and changed my salary 10 times, but God hasn't allowed him to harm me. Right? He talks about the ways that Laban was changing. Now, we didn't read that earlier, that's what was going on, that Laban would see more spotted ones and then be like, oh, let me switch. I'll take the spotted ones, you take the white ones. So if Jacob is telling the truth here, it's just a detail then that the writer left out, or Jacob is trying to, make his case to his wives about why he should leave, and he's trying to add in a little more detail to really convince them that we should go, which would kind of align with more of his deceptive nature that we've seen in the past. I don't know which way it is, but that's the way I kind of view it. But I understand if that's not exactly what it is. Whatever it is, whatever the reason, he comes up with this story and he's telling them what's happening. And then he talks about how God, the angel of God said to me in a dream, lift up your eyes and see all the males going with the flocks are striped and spotted and speckled. And I am the God of Bethel. You made a vow to me. Get up now and leave this land and return to the land of your relatives. Only the last part of that account that Jacob shares about what God said to him is what's recorded earlier. And so for that, we know is true. Get up now and leave this land and return to the land of your relatives. Is it possible that the rest of it, going back to verse 11, angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob, lift up your eyes, see that all the males going up to the flocks are striped, spotted, and speckled, for I've seen everything Laban has done for you. I am the God of Bethel. Is it possible that he kind of added those details in to justify why he's leaving with these sheep and where they're going and what his past is? I don't know. This is what the writer is reporting to us, what Jacob says to Rachel and Leah. Earlier, the writer told us what God told Jacob. So there's definitely a disconnect there. What the writer said earlier isn't what Jacob is saying now. He's got more detail. Maybe it's just that. So we'll see. But I don't know if we'll see. You'll just have to be patient. Ask God about that. I question it too. So their response, they say is there anything money left for us anyway? So they know that their dad has not been good and he's stolen everything from them anyway. He spent all their money and used up their bridal price. So everything that Jacob had been working for, Laban has used up. Again, this speaks to the contrast in natures. Is Jacob perfect? No. Is Rachel perfect? No. Is Leah perfect? No. Is Laban perfect? No. None of them are perfect. None of them. But who has God chosen? God has chosen Jacob. And so Jacob's the one that God is looking out for, and Jacob's the one that God is going to protect. and Jacob's the one that God is going to deliver, because it's Jacob that God has been faithful, is being faithful to, because he has made his promise through Jacob. Remember, that promise isn't just for Jacob or even Israel, it's to bless the whole earth, all the clans of the earth, and that promise is ultimately shown to us in the person of Jesus, the Messiah. So in none of this is anybody perfect or good. Again, as I said before, I want to harp on it. It's about God and his faithfulness and the plan of his salvation coming to fruition. Okay, so the story ends with Laban chasing after Jacob and the whole confrontation that they have. And he's like, God warns Laban, don't do anything to Jacob, good or bad. And again, that means, God is the one looking out for Jacob. God is the one who's protecting his covenant and his promise and everything else. It's not what Jacob is doing or Laban is doing or Rachel or Leah or anybody else. It's about God. Laban changes his story a little bit because it really does seem like he just wants to get back what he thinks is his, and that's his daughters, his grandchildren, his flocks, and his household gods. But after the vision, he changes it to just the household gods. Rachel, finds a way to hide them, saying she's having her time of the month. She can't get up from her bed, and so he doesn't find the idols. And Jacob feels vindicated about Laban chasing after him and everything else. And he just kind of vents. He just vomits like, you've treated me poorly all these years. And that is true. It is very true. Laban has definitely acted as an unrighteous agent. And it's evidenced here that he is not a believer in the God of Abraham or even the God of Nahor. He even says like your God and the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor. He has his own gods and that Rachel took. So it's very clear that he even worships another God and he follows a different way and a different path. And it's Jacob that God has chosen in this part of the story. And so they make a covenant, they make a witness, and they relate the name of the place is related to a mountain, a mound, a pile, and they make a covenant about mistreating my daughters, my wives, and you're not going to cross this place to come back after me. I'm not going to cross this place to go back after you. And it ends, it says he kissed his grandchildren, his daughters, he blesses them, and he leaves. And on the way, the angels of God met him, and then the story ends there because we end in verse 2. So we'll get into that later in next week's message or the teaching. Now, with the little time we have remaining, which we've already gotten to an hour, I do need to look at the Hosea passage. And so I'll try to make this as quick as possible. In Hosea, the verse starts in verse 13, or the reading starts in verse 13, and it talks about how Israel or Jacob, he fled and then he served for a wife, and how God, on the other hand, he saved Israel out of Egypt. And so there's a comparison brought between Israel and how he loved a wife and he then served for this wife. And I think what God is saying is, I brought Israel out of Egypt by a prophet. And I think it kind of shows, it heightens what God has done compared to what Jacob did. Sure, it's a noble thing that Jacob loved Rachel and he did all that, but ultimately we see a path for him that's a little different based on the story that we're telling here. But let's go forward. So in chapter 13, then it gives us more clarity. It says Ephraim spoke, and Ephraim is a reference to one of Joseph's sons, also a reference to Israel. It says he exalted himself in Israel, and again Israel is going back to Jacob, became guilty through Baal. They sin more and more. In verse 4, God says, I have been your God since we left Egypt. You should know no one else. I myself knew you in the wilderness, in the land of terrible drought. And verse 6, I think, is the clear connection between what we see with Jacob and what's going on now in the time as Hosea is prophesying and ministering to the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, and their acts of sin against God and their defiance towards him, and then his call of judgment on them. It says in verse 6, while they were fed, they were satisfied, and filled, their hearts became haughty or proud, and therefore they forgot me. And so I think in a way, this speaks to us about the nature of what Jacob was like. Jacob was prospering. He got a lot of wealth. He had a lot of sons. He had 2 wives, 2 other maid servants. He was doing really well. And he came up with this plan for his wages and grew up these flocks and everything else. And then then he saw, it wasn't until he saw Laban's face where he's like, oh man, Laban is mad at me now. That's when God comes back into the picture in terms of Jacob and God having a relationship with each other. Like he saw, oh, my life's in danger. I got to get out of here. Right. And so he has the dream. God tells him, go ahead and go home. And that's when he's like, I got to get out of here. Otherwise, it seems like he was just fine there, doing what he was doing, growing his wealth and everything else. And for the people of Israel, they went the same way. God's saying right here, they grew into the land. They were comfortable. They fed. They grew strong. Their hearts became proud, and they forgot me. And in the book of Deuteronomy, when God lays out the plans and the law and everything else, and he says and talks about keeping Passover, one of the reasons for remembering Passover is so that you do not forget how God, the Lord your God, brought you out of Egypt, and where you started as slaves and how I saved you. And so it's really important because we can grow in wealth and grow in prosperity, but then as a result, we forget God until we run into trouble. Then it's like we remember. And so that's what verse 7 says. So if, I became like a lion to them, like a leopard lying in by the way, but like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will devour them like a lioness. The beast of the field will rip them to shreds. I highlighted those verses. It's very graphic, but it's all pointing to the judgment that's coming to them in the forms of foreign kingdoms and foreign nations ruling over them. Daniel has visions also about lions and leopards and bears and the Medo-Persian Empire and the Babylonian Empire and the Greek Empire and the beast of the field. That would probably be the Roman Empire. And the main verse there to like kind of tie it into understanding in verse 10, it says, where then is your king? Remember, Israel wanted a king, both the northern and southern kingdoms, and then they separated and they had their own kings. It said, give me a king, give me a king. And so in verse 11, it says, I give you a king in my anger, and I take him away in my wrath. And so what he's saying is, I'm going to give you a king that I'm giving you in anger. And that's again a reference back to, you have Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and Darius and all these people that come in, and Alexander and then Antiochus, and later in their history who performs the grave act in the temple, like 167 I think BC. And then you had the Romans and Hadrian and everybody else. And so God is telling them, you forget about me because I prosper you. You forget about me. And then as you forget about me, then you want someone else to rule over you. And as you want someone else to rule over you, and so I say, okay, fine, go ahead and have someone else rule over you. And in that happening, they're going to experience pain and suffering and realize that they have erred in their ways. And so in verse 14, God says to himself, he's asking, should I ransom them from the hand of Sheol, from the grave? Should I bring them out of there? Should I redeem them from death? And in verse 15 again reiterates, east wind will come, a wind from Adonai. It's again pointing to the east where Babylon is, and the nation's coming to take them up, and that they're going to be dry and their fountain will be dry. And so it's very bleary, this outlook here that's painted for us in the book of Hosea. And you look at the life of Jacob and you compare the two, what you're also learning, hopefully all of us are learning, is again that people are not faithful. God is the one who's faithful, and people just aren't. And we might cycle in individual lives through periods of faithfulness and blessing and looking at God and recognizing who he is, and then we go back into a period of forgetting who he is. We have these undulations, is what C.S. Lewis called it, the law of undulation, these ups and downs that we have. And for the nation itself, the nation of Israel, and Hosea is prophesying towards a great big long time of dryness that they're going to have. Samaria will bear her guilt. Speaking again of the northern kingdom, they will fall by the sword. Just terrible imagery that I don't want to read in case kids are listening, but there in verse 2. But then again returns back to God and his faithfulness to his covenant as people. In verse 3 it says, take the words with you and return to Adonai. Say to him, take away all iniquity, accept what is good, so we may repay with offerings of our lips. So not something physical, but offerings of our lips, which is referring to confession and repentance, going back to the covenant you've made with God. And before, Assyria won't save us, we won't ride on horses. Those are all sins that the northern kingdom committed, trusting in other nations to help them. And Assyria, and they had called for Assyria for help, and later they would go to Egypt to get horses to try to fight Assyria as a whole. The whole history is there laid out for us, because never again will we say our God to the work of our hands. Speaking of the idolatry, for you orphans find mercy, understanding what is important to God. And in verse 5, I will heal their backsliding, I will love them freely, for my anger will turn away from him. I will be like dew for Israel, he will blossom like a lily and thrust out his roots from Lebanon. And it continues there as it closes with just more imagery of how they're going to be restored and brought back. And these verses speak to the last cycle of God's, just this up and down, the last part of the cycle, this ultimate restoration, where the tree shoots out and the olive tree and the fragrance of Lebanon and everything else. And all of that is a reference to Jesus and the second part of the promise to Abraham to bless all the world through his seed. And that's kind of like known as the time of the Gentiles. And so the understanding is that right now, is God still faithful to Israel? Does he still love Israel? We see Israel, we see what they're doing now with the war in Palestine and Gaza and everything else. And it's so easy to fall into a trap of like, oh, whatever they do is okay, it's right because God is on their side. That's just not how it works. These stories in the Old Testament, in Genesis, I said before, they're not about the fact that these people and what they did or what they do is always accepted by God, and that he's okay with what they've done, and that he's just always going to love them. It's unconditional, and he's not going to have anything bad to say about what they do. It's not at all the case. What these stories tell us, how they're framed, what they're framed to teach us, teach the people of Israel, and then for those of us as Gentiles who now believe in Jesus as Messiah, is that the people are messy and they're wrong, and the ancestors fail in so many ways, and God interacts with them, and yet he's gracious to them. And at the same time, he reminds them of their failures. Next week, we're going to read about God and Jacob wrestling, and the whole, the thing with his leg, and just a lifelong reminder of the pain of wrestling with God and not obeying him and not submitting to him, that kind of thing. It's all pictured there for us. And to think that at any given point, that just because God has chosen someone, that the person that he's chosen is then, wiped clean of any guilt, it's just wrong. We can be chosen by God, but then also be seen as someone who's disobedient to him. Someone who is not following his way. Someone who is not pleasing him in what he's done or what we've done. And ultimately, what's going to save us is his faithfulness to his covenant with us. And so we can have faith and we can walk in his way. We can try our best to walk in his way, to follow the path of the Lord. And Jesus lays that out for us in Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 6 and chapter 7, in the narrow way and the broad way, and just what it looks like, the Sermon on the Mount, to love your neighbor as yourself, and the story of the Good Samaritan, everything else that's there is taught to show us what the way is that God wants us to live on earth. Ultimately, we fail, we succeed. Whether or not we enter into the kingdom and the covenant in its fullness with God is dependent on him and his faithfulness to us. And so what I would just close out with saying is, just remember, we all are in need of grace. We're all in need of God's patience and his love and his faithful kindness. At the same time, check yourself check yourself and check what you're doing with your life, check what you're doing with your words and what you're saying with your time, and just how you're living your life, because it is possible for you to get fat off of God's blessings and then forget Him altogether. And what we really need then is to be grounded in our salvation, in our moment history of time where we were brought out of slavery. And for Israel, that was Passover and remembering the deliverance from Egypt and the 10 plagues. And for us, it's remembering the Lord Jesus, His death on the cross, His resurrection, which can be done in the practice of communion, the Lord's Supper with the bread and the wine. And that's a moment where you can ground yourself in that reality, in that one truth at the beginning where you were set free. And so that is vital, I think, to remaining in a place where, yes, God's covenant is based on Him, but we're also finding ourselves walking in a way that is pleasing to Him, which ultimately is all I really want to do. My salvation, I'm not worried about. I know I'm saved. I'm going to be with God and my eternity, all this stuff, but I also want to live a life on this earth that's pleasing to Him, and I would hope that you would too. All right, thank you for watching. I know this one's a little bit longer than normal, but I think it was time well spent. And until next time, God bless, and remember to share with friends. I've been speaking to people, and so probably have some new followers and watchers. And so I thank you for doing that, and continue to subscribe and like and everything else. You can find it on the podcast or my pages on Instagram, on YouTube, on Facebook, I'm on Blue Sky, on Threads. Just it's all there. So just look up the I Am Barabbas podcast or my name, Reggie Thiel, on those platforms. You should be able to find my social media and connect with me through any of those platforms. All right, so thank you again for watching. Until next time, I hope you're truly blessed and enjoying the study of the scriptures with me.